The autumn breeze rustled through the meticulously maintained garden of Margaret Chen's suburban home, where the 68-year-old woman had lived for the past 3 decades. Despite the partial paralysis that had claimed the left side of her body 5 years ago, Margaret maintained her independence with quiet dignity, adapting to her new limitations while preserving the gentle demeanor that had earned her the neighborhood's affection. That Wednesday afternoon started like any other. Margaret was tending to her prized orchids near the front window, her movements deliberate and measured as she navigated her wheelchair through the familiar space. The new neighbors across the street, the Pattersons, had moved in just 2 weeks ago, and Margaret hadn't yet had the opportunity to welcome them properly, a departure from her usual tradition of greeting newcomers with her famous homemade dumplings. As she adjusted her reading glasses to examine a particularly delicate bloom, a basketball crashed through her front window, sending shards of glass cascading across her hardwood floor. The sudden chaos startled Margaret, causing her to jerk backward in her wheelchair. Through the broken window, she could hear the Patterson boys arguing loudly about whose fault it was. Margaret attempted to call out to them, to assure them it was all right, but her speech, affected by her condition, came out slurred and halting. Mrs. Patterson, hearing the commotion and Margaret's unclear speech, misinterpreted the situation entirely. Assuming the worst and seeing Margaret's agitated movements, she frantically dialed 911, reporting what she described as an unstable woman having some kind of episode. Officers Mark Reynolds and Trevor Barnes arrived within minutes, their approach colored by the dispatcher's description of an erratic elderly Asian woman, possibly intoxicated or mentally disturbed. They entered through the unlocked front door, their heavy boots crunching on broken glass, hands hovering near their weapons. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Officer Reynolds called out, his voice sharp with authority. Margaret turned her wheelchair slowly, trying to explain the situation, but her words came out garbled due to her partial paralysis. "Please, window. Boys," she managed, gesturing with her right hand while her left lay immobile in her lap. The officers exchanged glances, interpreting her impaired speech and movements as signs of intoxication or defiance. "Step out of the wheelchair," Barnes commanded, moving closer. Margaret's eyes widened in confusion and fear. She tried again to explain, her anxiety making her speech even more difficult to understand. "I said, step out of the wheelchair," Barnes repeated, his patience wearing thin. Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to show them her medical alert bracelet, but Reynolds interpreted her movement as reaching for something threatening. In an instant, the situation spiraled horrifically out of control. What followed was 3 minutes of excessive force that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come. The officers forcibly removed Margaret from her wheelchair, ignoring her cries of pain and the medical alert bracelet that clearly identified her condition. They pinned her to the glass-strewn floor, their knees pressing into her back as they handcuffed her wrists, oblivious to her physical limitations and genuine distress. Mrs. Patterson watched in horror from her front porch as additional patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in alternating red and blue. The neighborhood children, including the Patterson boys, stood frozen, witnessing the brutal treatment of the woman who had always offered them warm smiles and occasional cookies when they passed by her garden. By the time paramedics arrived, Margaret's face was bruised, her breathing labored, and her dignity shattered. The same hands that had tenderly cared for orchids now bore the harsh marks of handcuffs, and her previously immaculate living room was a chaos of broken glass, overturned plants, and scattered soil. As they loaded her into the ambulance, one young paramedic noticed her medical alert bracelet and blanched, immediately documenting its presence with a quick photo on his phone, an action that would later prove crucial. Throughout the neighborhood, doors closed and curtains drew shut, but behind them, phones recorded and neighbors whispered, their sense of security in their own community irrevocably shaken. None of them knew that this incident would soon become the catalyst for a battle that would shake the very foundations of the local police department, spearheaded by a son whose love for his mother would prove more formidable than any badge or uniform. James Chen stood before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, his commanding presence holding the attention of every judge on the bench. At 42, he had earned a reputation as one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys on the East Coast, known for dismantling systemic injustice with surgical precision. As he delivered his closing arguments in a landmark discrimination case, his phone vibrated repeatedly in his pocket, calls he habitually ignored while in court. Only when Judge Marshall called for a brief recess did James check his messages. 15 missed calls. The first few from his mother's neighbors, then from the hospital, and finally from Detective Sarah Martinez, an old colleague who'd left him a cryptic message. "James, it's about your mother. Call me immediately." His heart clenched as he dialed Sarah's number, stepping into an empty conference room. The detective's voice was tight with controlled anger as she explained what had happened. Each detail hit James like a physical blow. The broken window, the miscommunication, the brutal takedown of his mother. His hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a rage so profound it threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained professional composure. "I'm at Memorial Hospital," Sarah concluded. "James, it's bad. You need to be here." The 20-minute drive to the hospital became a blur of red lights and horn blasts as James navigated traffic with reckless determination. His mind raced through every case he'd ever handled involving police brutality, but this was different. This time, it wasn't a client's pain he was processing. It was his mother, the woman who had raised him alone after his father's death, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, who had never lost her gentle spirit even after her stroke left her partially paralyzed. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as James rushed through the corridors, his Oxford shoes echoing against the linoleum. He found Sarah waiting outside room 412, her detective's badge glinting under the institutional lighting. The look on her face told him everything before she could speak. "They didn't even check her medical alert bracelet, James," Sarah said quietly, her professional detachment cracking. They just went in hard." Nothing in his 15 years of litigation could have prepared James for what he saw when he entered that room. Margaret Chen, the woman who had cultivated award-winning orchids and taught him the value of patient persistence, lay small and broken in the hospital bed. Her face was mottled with bruises, her left arm bent at an unnatural angle. The sight of medical tubes snaking from her body sent him back to the day of her stroke. But this was worse. So much worse. "Mom," he whispered, taking her right hand gently in his. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and despite her injuries, she tried to smile. The effort made tears roll down her swollen cheeks. "My son," she managed, her speech even more impaired than usual. "Not your fault. The boys. Just an accident." Even now, she was trying to protect others, to minimize the situation. James felt something shift inside him, a fundamental change in his worldview. He had spent his career fighting for justice within the system, believing in the power of legal reform. But seeing his mother like this, knowing that the very people sworn to protect and serve had inflicted this damage, awakened something darker and more urgent in his soul. Detective Martinez handed him her preliminary report, along with statements from horrified neighbors. As James read, his trained legal mind began cataloging evidence, identifying witnesses, and formulating strategies. But beneath the professional analysis, a more personal mission was taking shape. "I'll handle the investigation from here," Sarah said, heading for the door. She paused, turning back. "James, the department's already closing ranks. They're calling it justified use of force, claiming she was combative." James looked up from the report, his expression hardening into something that would have made the officers involved step back had they seen it. "They have no idea what's coming," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both promise and threat. As the hospital machines beeped steadily in the background, James Chen began his transformation from respected civil rights attorney to a son on a mission of justice. He pulled out his phone and made a call to his office. Cancel everything. Clear my calendar indefinitely. Then he settled into the chair beside his mother's bed, opened his laptop, and began to type. The war had begun, the cover-up. Within hours of Margaret Chen's hospitalization, the machinery of institutional protection began turning. Captain Howard Drake sat in his office at the precinct, pinching the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the preliminary incident report. Officers Reynolds and Barnes stood before his desk, their uniforms still crisp despite the afternoon's events. So you're telling me, Drake said slowly, that you used necessary force to subdue an uncooperative subject who appeared intoxicated and potentially dangerous. He looked up at his officers, his expression unreadable. And this subject just happened to be a disabled senior citizen in a wheelchair. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we followed protocol. She wasn't responding to verbal commands, and her movements were erratic. Save it, Drake interrupted, dropping a folder on his desk. Do you know who her son is? James Chen. The same James Chen who's won 7 brutality cases against 3 different precincts in the last 2 years. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. This needs to disappear. Now. Across town, in the hospital's security office, a junior IT technician received an urgent request from the police department to temporarily suspend all external security camera feeds from the time of the incident. Similar calls went out to neighbors, polite but firm requests to turn over any surveillance footage as part of an ongoing investigation. What the department didn't know was that James Chen had spent years cultivating relationships with officers who shared his vision of accountability. One of them, Officer Michael Torres, sat in his patrol car that evening, copying files before they could be altered. His hands trembled slightly as he transferred the original body cam footage to a secure drive. In 15 years on the force, he'd seen plenty of cover-ups, but this one turned his stomach. The body cameras malfunctioned during the incident. Lieutenant Sarah Parker announced at the hastily convened press conference the next morning. However, our officers followed all departmental procedures in responding to a potentially volatile situation. She stuck to the script, avoiding specific details about Margaret's injuries or condition. Behind the scenes, the cover-up accelerated. Officer Barnes's initial report, which mentioned Margaret's medical alert bracelet, was replaced with a revised version citing suspicious movements consistent with intoxication. The dispatch recording, where Mrs. Patterson clearly described a broken window and confused elderly woman, was logged as corrupted data. But James Chen had anticipated every move. While the department scrambled, his network was already in motion. Lisa Martinez, a dispatch supervisor who'd helped him expose corruption 3 years earlier, secretly preserved the original call recordings. 2 rookie officers, sickened by what they'd witnessed, reached out through secure channels to share what they'd seen. The most standing evidence came from an unexpected source. Tommy Patterson, the 12-year-old whose basketball had started it all, had been recording a TikTok video of his trick shots when the incident began. His phone captured everything: the broken window, his mother's panicked call, and most importantly, the officer's brutal response to Margaret's obvious disability. They're saying she was violent. Detective Sarah Martinez told James over a secure line, her voice tight with controlled anger. Drake's pushing a narrative about officer safety and split-second decisions. They've already got internal affairs lined up to rubber stamp their version. James sat in his home office, surrounded by documents and digital files accumulated over just 24 hours. On his screens, multiple versions of the official report showed the subtle changes being made in real time, each iteration moving further from the truth. A message popped up from Officer Torres. They're asking for all body cams to be turned in for routine maintenance. Moving now. Let them dig their hole deeper, James replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he documented each attempted alteration. Years of fighting police misconduct had taught him to anticipate their playbook. But this time, he wasn't just building a case, he was laying a trap. In the hospital, Margaret slept fitfully, unaware of the storm gathering around her case. The orchid by her bedside, brought from her shattered garden, bloomed defiantly in the sterile room. Outside her door, two trusted private security guards, former clients of James, kept watch, their presence ensuring no routine questioning could take place without her son's knowledge. Captain Drake's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Chen's making moves. He's already got Torres. Drake's face paled as he realized this cover-up was about to become the biggest mistake of his career. In trying to bury one incident of brutality, they had given James Chen exactly what he needed: proof of systemic corruption that went all the way to the top. James Chen's office had transformed into a war room. 3 monitors displayed surveillance footage from different angles, while the walls were covered with timeline charts and personnel files. In the 5 days since his mother's assault, he had slept perhaps 10 hours total, sustained by coffee and cold determination. "You need to see this," Sarah Martinez said, placing a thick folder on his desk. "I pulled every excessive force complaint filed against Reynolds and Barnes in the last 5 years. There's a pattern." She spread out 12 incident reports, each bearing uncomfortable similarities to Margaret's case. They target vulnerable people: elderly, disabled, non-English speakers, people less likely to fight back. James picked up one report, his jaw tightening as he read. Maria Gonzalez, 72, hard of hearing. They claimed she was resisting arrest when she couldn't hear their commands. He moved to another. Robert Kim, 65, Parkinson's disease. They said his tremors looked suspicious. Each case had been quietly settled, the victims silenced by modest payouts and intimidation. At the hospital, Margaret was making slow progress, but the psychological trauma ran deep. During physical therapy, she flinched at every sudden movement, every raised voice. James watched through the window as she struggled to rebuild her strength, his tablet recording each grimace of pain for the case file. "I keep seeing their faces," Margaret whispered during one visit, her good hand clutching James's. "When I close my eyes, I see them coming towards me, not listening." She trailed off, tears sliding down her still bruised face. James carefully documented her words, each one fueling his resolve. Tommy Patterson's TikTok video proved invaluable, but James needed more. Working with Lisa from Dispatch, he reconstructed the entire response timeline. The footage showed officers Reynolds and Barnes arriving at 2:47 p.m. By 2:50 p.m., they had already escalated to physical force. No de-escalation attempts, no effort to understand the situation. Your mother's medical alert bracelet was clearly visible in the security footage, Michael Torres reported, pointing to a freeze frame from his preserved body cam footage. They had to have seen it. They chose to ignore it. James's network within the department grew as more officers came forward, disgusted by the cover-up. A young officer named Rachel Chen, no relation, provided access to the department's training records. Reynolds and Barnes skipped the last 3 disability awareness seminars, she revealed. Drake marked them as attended anyway. The investigation expanded beyond Margaret's case. James discovered that Captain Drake had systematically buried complaints against his favorite officers for years. Internal affairs investigations were rushed or redirected, evidence disappeared, and witnesses were pressured into changing their statements. "They're watching you," Sarah warned one evening as they reviewed footage in James's office. "Drake's got his people monitoring your movements. They're afraid of what you'll find." "Let them watch," James replied, not looking up from his computer. He had just received an encrypted email from a senior officer ready to testify about the department's pattern of targeting vulnerable citizens. They should be afraid. Margaret's neighbors, initially hesitant to speak out, began sharing their stories. Mrs. Patterson, racked with guilt over her 911 call, provided a detailed statement about how the dispatcher had mischaracterized her words. Other residents came forward with cell phone videos and security footage, each clip adding to the mounting evidence of police misconduct. But the most standing evidence came from an unexpected source. A retired internal affairs investigator, terminal with cancer, and free from fear of retaliation, reached out to James. "I've been keeping records," he said during their meeting in a private hospital room. "Every case they buried, every officer they protected. Your mother's case isn't isolated. It's the result of decades of systematic abuse." James worked methodically, building not just a case, but an irrefutable narrative of corruption. Each piece of evidence was carefully authenticated and backed up in multiple secure locations. He knew the department would try to discredit him, paint him as a vengeful son rather than a professional attorney. But the evidence spoke for itself. In his mother's garden, now restored by caring neighbors, James sat among the orchids she had tended so carefully. Tomorrow, he would begin the legal proceedings that would shake the department to its core. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not as an attorney building a case, but as a son watching his mother struggle to recover from an assault that should never have occurred. The police union's conference room crackled with tension as Patrick Sullivan, the union president, paced before the assembled officers. On the screen behind him, newspaper headlines screamed about Margaret Chen's assault, while surveillance photos of James Chen meeting with various officers filled the adjacent wall. "This stops now," Sullivan declared, his face flushed with anger. "Chen is trying to tear this department apart from the inside. Anyone caught cooperating with him will face immediate suspension and loss of pension benefits." In the back of the room, Officer Michael Torres exchanged glances with Rachel Chen. They weren't the only ones uncomfortable with Sullivan's threats. After 2 weeks of mounting evidence and public pressure, cracks were beginning to show in the department's united front. "With all due respect, sir," a veteran surgeon named David Miller stood up, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "We're supposed to protect and serve. What happened to Mrs. Chen? That's not what we signed up for." Sullivan's response was immediate and harsh. "Sit down, Miller. You weren't there. You don't get to question officers making split-second decisions in the field." "I was there." A quiet voice came from the doorway. All heads turned to see Officer Sarah Martinez, her detective's badge gleaming. "I arrived 3 minutes after the initial response, and what I saw wasn't police work, it was assault." The room erupted into chaos. Officers took sides, some defending Reynolds and Barnes, others calling for accountability. Captain Drake watched from the corner, his face ashen as he witnessed his department fracturing before his eyes. Across town, in James Chen's office, emails and text messages poured in from officers who'd been at the meeting. The union's heavy-handed tactics were backfiring spectacularly, pushing more officers to break ranks. "They're threatening our pensions," one message read. "But my daughter asked me last night if I hurt people like Mrs. Chen. I can't look her in the eye and stay silent." James carefully documented each communication, building a picture of systemic intimidation. But he was also watching another pattern emerge, a generational divide within the force. Younger officers, trained in modern community policing techniques, were increasingly vocal about their disgust with the old guard's tactics. The internal battle reached a boiling point when Officer Reynolds, one of Margaret's attackers, attempted to justify his actions during a mandatory department meeting. "She was non-compliant," he insisted, his voice echoing through the precinct's briefing room. "We followed procedure." "Bullshit." The interruption came from Officer Jessica Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran. "I watched the footage. All of it. She was trying to show you her medical alert bracelet. You chose not to see it." Reynolds moved toward Rodriguez aggressively, but found himself facing a wall of younger officers who stepped between them. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on anyone. The thin blue line was being redrawn, not between police and civilians, but between those who sought justice and those who abused their power. Captain Drake's attempt to maintain control deteriorated further when an anonymous email circulated through the department containing years of buried complaints against Reynolds and Barnes. The email traced a pattern of escalating violence, all sanctioned and hidden by department leadership. "They're eating their own," Sarah Martinez reported to James during a secure meeting in his office. "Half the force is ready to testify about the cover-up culture. The other half is terrified of what you'll expose next." The union's last-ditch effort to salvage the situation came in the form of a settlement offer. A substantial payout to Margaret, with no admission of wrongdoing and no departmental reforms. James didn't even bother responding. Instead, he released a statement that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. "This isn't about money. This is about ensuring that no mother, father, or vulnerable citizen ever faces such brutality again. The officers involved, and the system that protected them, will be held accountable." That evening, as James visited his mother in the rehabilitation facility where she was slowly recovering, Officer Torres sent him a crucial piece of information. Captain Drake had ordered the destruction of key evidence, but 3 honest officers had refused the order, documenting everything. "Your mother's case," Torres wrote, "it's become a symbol. Young officers are wearing medical alert bracelets in protest. They're calling it the Margaret Movement. This isn't just about police brutality anymore. It's about the soul of our department." James showed the message to his mother, who was finally strong enough to sit in her garden again. She touched the fresh bruises on her arm, then looked at her son with fierce pride. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it takes darkness to show us where the light needs to shine." His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "They're planning to hold a press conference tomorrow. Going to claim your mother attacked them first." James smiled grimly as he typed his response. Perfect timing. Let them dig their grave a little deeper. Part 6. Media Explosion. The security footage hit social media at exactly 9:00 a.m. on a Monday. Within hours, #Justice for Margaret was trending nationwide. The video, showing Margaret Chen's brutal treatment, played on every major news network, each replay adding fuel to an already explosive situation. Tonight's top story, the CNN anchor began, her voice grave. Disturbing footage has emerged of police officers in Millbrook assaulting Margaret Chen, a 68-year-old disabled woman, in her own home. Warning: the following content may be disturbing to viewers. The timing was strategic. James Chen had orchestrated the release to coincide with the department's planned press conference, where they had intended to paint his mother as the aggressor. Instead, Captain Drake found himself facing a media ambush, with reporters armed with not just the security footage, but a comprehensive dossier of departmental abuse compiled by James's growing network of whistleblowers. Captain Drake, a veteran reporter from the Washington Post, called out, "How do you explain the 17 previous complaints against officers Reynolds and Barnes, all involving excessive force against vulnerable citizens?" Drake's face blanched. Another reporter jumped in. "Is it standard procedure to ignore medical alert jewelry when assaulting disabled seniors?" The press conference imploded spectacularly. As Drake fled the podium, local activist groups had already begun gathering outside the police station. Their signs told Margaret's story: "Protect our elders. Who polices the police?" And most damaging, she could be your mother. Social media amplified the outrage. Tommy Patterson's TikTok video of the incident went viral, with celebrities and influencers sharing it alongside calls for justice. The 12-year-old's tearful interview about witnessing the assault resonated deeply. "Mrs. Chen always gave us cookies. She couldn't hurt anyone. She just couldn't understand what they were saying." National civil rights organizations descended on Millbrook. The ACLU announced it was joining James's legal team, while disability rights advocates organized protests nationwide. Margaret's story had touched a nerve, highlighting the intersection of police brutality, ageism, and disability rights. What happened to Margaret Chen represents a systemic failure, renowned civil rights leader Reverend Marcus Johnson declared during a rally that drew thousands. When those sworn to protect us become the ones we fear most, the entire system needs to change. Inside the hospital, Margaret watched the coverage with mixed emotions. "So many people," she whispered, touching the TV screen where protesters carried signs with her photo. "All this because of me." "Because of them," James corrected gently. "Because people are tired of power being abused." The media attention forced long-buried stories to surface. Other victims of Reynolds and Barnes came forward, their testimonies creating a damning portrait of departmental corruption. Lisa Martinez, the dispatch supervisor, released audio recordings showing a pattern of discriminatory response practices. They coded calls differently based on the caller's accent or perceived status, she explained in a devastating 60 Minutes interview. Certain neighborhoods, certain types of people, they were automatically treated as threats. The police union's attempts to control the narrative backfired spectacularly. Their statement calling Margaret combative was met with a flood of social media posts from her neighbors, sharing stories of her kindness and showing photos of her award-winning garden. Local businesses displayed signs reading, "Margaret's garden stands with Margaret Chen." International media picked up the story. The BBC ran a special report on police brutality against disabled individuals in America, featuring Margaret's case as a prime example. Chinese-language newspapers covered the story extensively, leading to protests outside U.S. embassies in several Asian countries. This isn't just about one incident, James explained during a primetime interview. This is about a system that views vulnerability as a threat and violence as a solution. My mother's case has simply made the invisible visible. The footage of Margaret's assault became a teaching tool in police academies across the country, an example of what not to do. Reform advocates used it to push for mandatory disability awareness training and stricter accountability measures. As public outrage grew, political pressure mounted. The mayor, initially silent, called for an independent investigation. State legislators began drafting Margaret's Law, aimed at protecting disabled individuals during police encounters. In her garden, now restored and tended by caring neighbors, Margaret sat with James, watching butterflies dance among her orchids. A news van idled outside, one of many that had become a constant presence in their lives. "All these cameras," Margaret said softly, her speech still affected but growing stronger. "All these people watching. Maybe now they'll see what you've always fought for." James squeezed her hand gently. The media explosion had done more than expose one instance of police brutality. It had cracked open the door to systemic change. And through that door, justice was finally beginning to march. Part 7. The Legal Strategy. The conference room of Chen Legal Associates hummed with intensity as James stood before a wall of evidence, addressing some of the nation's most prominent civil rights attorneys. Photos, documents, and timelines covered every surface, each piece carefully selected to tell Margaret's story. "This isn't just about excessive force," James began, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "We're challenging the entire system of qualified immunity that shields officers from accountability." He pointed to a series of case files. Every failed lawsuit, every dismissed complaint, they've created a blueprint of what doesn't work. We're going to do something different. Catherine Rodriguez, a Supreme Court veteran known for overturning decades of bad precedent, studied the evidence wall. "You're not just going after the officers or even the department," she observed. "You're targeting the entire framework that enables police brutality." "Exactly," James confirmed, pulling up a complex diagram on the main screen. "We've identified 3 critical vulnerabilities in the qualified immunity doctrine. Margaret's case hits all 3. The legal strategy was unprecedented in its scope. Rather than focusing solely on the assault, James had constructed a RICO-style case demonstrating a pattern of systematic abuse. The department's attempted cover-up provided the thread that connected decades of similar incidents. "We can prove they knew," Sarah Martinez explained, highlighting key documents. "Every time they buried a complaint, every time they falsified training records, they created a paper trail of deliberate indifference." The team worked around the clock, building what would become known as the Chen Framework, a three-pronged attack on police impunity. First, challenge the department's training practices. Second, expose the system of internal cover-ups. Third, demonstrate how qualified immunity had become a tool for enabling abuse rather than protecting legitimate police work. Margaret's testimony was recorded in her garden, surrounded by her beloved orchids. Her quiet dignity and clear recollection of events, devastating in their simplicity. "I just wanted to show them my bracelet," she said, holding up her medical alert jewelry. "They didn't want to see it." The legal team also focused on the psychological impact. Dr. Sarah Wong, a renowned trauma specialist, documented how the assault had affected Margaret's recovery from her original stroke. "They didn't just hurt her physically," Dr. Wong testified in her deposition. "They violated her sense of safety in her own home, her trust in the institutions meant to protect her." James worked with disability rights organizations to demonstrate how qualified immunity disproportionately affected vulnerable populations. "Officers claim they can't be expected to recognize medical conditions in the heat of the moment," he argued in a preliminary hearing. "Yet they're trained to identify dozens of other threat indicators in seconds. This selective blindness is a choice." The department's defense began to crumble when James introduced evidence of systemic discrimination. Internal emails revealed that officers Reynolds and Barnes had specifically requested assignments in neighborhoods with high concentrations of elderly and disabled residents. Their arrest records showed a disturbing pattern of escalating force against vulnerable citizens. "They were predators with badges," Officer Torres testified, his voice steady despite the death threats he received. "And the department gave them hunting grounds." The legal strategy's masterstroke came when James introduced a parallel civil rights suit on behalf of every victim of Reynolds and Barnes from the past 5 years. Each case strengthened the others, creating a mosaic of abuse that no court could ignore. "Your Honor," James addressed Judge Patricia Montgomery, "we're not asking you to change the law. We're asking you to apply it as it was intended, to protect citizens from abuse of power, not to shield abusers from consequences." The police union's attorneys fought back hard, arguing that allowing the case to proceed would make officers hesitate in dangerous situations. But James was prepared. He presented studies showing that departments with stricter accountability measures had lower rates of civilian casualties and higher arrest success rates. Margaret attended each hearing, her presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. Other victims and their families filled the courtroom, their stories woven into the larger narrative of systemic failure and necessary change. Late one evening, as James reviewed depositions in his office, Margaret brought him tea, her movements slower but more confident than in the months since the assault. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting carefully in the chair across from him. "After this is over, after we win, what happens to the other Margarets out there? The ones without lawyer sons?" James looked up at his mother, seeing in her eyes the same concern for others that had made her beloved in her community. "That's why we're doing this, Mom," he replied. "We're not just fighting for justice. We're fighting to change the system that made justice necessary in the first place." The next morning, as James prepared to present their core argument to the federal court, news arrived that would change everything. 3 more officers had come forward, ready to testify about years of systematic abuse and cover-ups. The wall of silence was crumbling, and with it, the foundation of qualified immunity itself. Department in crisis. The emergency meeting of the city council stretched into its 6th hour as Captain Drake faced increasingly hostile questioning. The chamber was packed, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway. On the wall behind the council members, a photo of Margaret Chen's bruised face served as a silent accusation. "Let me understand this correctly. Councilwoman Helena Martinez leaned forward, her voice sharp. You're telling us that in the past decade, there have been 147 complaints of excessive force against vulnerable citizens, and not a single one was sustained. Drake's attempted response was cut short by the city attorney, who slid a note across the table. The captain's face grew ashen as he read it. 3 more officers had just submitted sworn affidavits detailing years of systematic cover-ups. The department was imploding. That morning, Police Chief Richard Wilson had submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons. But the leaked emails told a different story. He'd known about Reynolds and Barnes's history of targeting vulnerable citizens and had actively protected them. It's like watching a house of cards collapse, Sarah Martinez observed, sending James Chen the latest internal memo. Officers were turning on each other, each trying to save themselves. The thin blue line had become a circular firing squad. Inside the precinct, the chaos was palpable. Young officers openly refused orders from supervisors implicated in the cover-up. The union representatives, once powerful figures who could make or break careers, found themselves isolated and ignored. I've got 20 years on the force, Sergeant Miller testified before the Internal Affairs Commission, his voice breaking. I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I told myself it wasn't my problem. Mrs. Chen made me realize it was always my problem. Our silence made us complicit. The crisis deepened when financial audits revealed a pattern of suspicious payments. The department had been using asset forfeiture funds to settle potential complaints quietly, buying silence while officially maintaining a clean record. They called it the Problem Solver Fund. Officer Rachel Chen explained in her deposition. If someone threatened to go public with abuse allegations, they'd get a visit from Internal Affairs. It wasn't an investigation. It was a negotiation. The public's trust, already shaken by Margaret's case, crumbled completely when body camera footage from dozens of other incidents was anonymously uploaded to a whistleblower website. Each video showed the same pattern. Vulnerable citizens being treated with unnecessary force, followed by coordinated cover-ups. Mayor Elizabeth Stanford, initially supportive of the department, faced her own crisis. Emails proved she had been briefed on problematic officers months before Margaret's assault, but had chosen not to act. The political fallout was immediate and severe. A complete restructuring is necessary, the mayor announced at an emergency press conference. We will be implementing civilian oversight with real power, mandatory disability awareness training, and a zero-tolerance policy for excessive force. But for many officers, these changes came too late. Resignations poured in, especially from senior ranks. Those who remained faced a crisis of confidence and identity. I joined to protect people, Officer Jessica Rodriguez said during a community meeting. Somewhere along the way, we became the thing people needed protection from. Mrs. Chen's case showed us what we'd become. The department's crisis reached its peak when state investigators uncovered evidence that Captain Drake had ordered the destruction of evidence in multiple cases. The same day, Officers Reynolds and Barnes were arrested by federal agents for civil rights violations. Not just in Margaret's case, but in a dozen others. In Margaret's Garden, now a symbol of resilience featured in national news stories, James showed his mother the latest developments on his tablet. They're not just changing policies, Mom. They're changing the culture that made this possible. Margaret touched a blooming orchid, its petals nearly as bruised as she had been. Sometimes, she said softly, beautiful things grow from broken places. The crisis had evolved beyond a single department's failure. It had become a national referendum on police accountability. Departments across the country, seeing Millbrook's implosion, began proactively implementing reforms. Inside the precinct, officers found Margaret's medical alert bracelet in the evidence room. It had been logged incorrectly, another small cover-up in a mountain of deception. Officer Torres personally returned it to her, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We were supposed to be better than this. Margaret took the bracelet, then reached for Torres's hand. Then be better, she said simply. Not for me. For all the others who can't fight back. As the department entered its darkest hour, a new generation of officers began to emerge. Ones who saw Margaret's case not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a lesson to be learned. The old system was dying, but from its ashes, something new and more accountable was beginning to rise. Victory and change. The federal courthouse steps were crowded on the morning of the settlement announcement. Margaret Chen sat in her wheelchair, her son James standing protectively beside her, as reporters and cameras captured what would become a historic moment in police reform. Today, James began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. We announce not just a settlement, but a transformation. The Margaret Chen Police Accountability Act will fundamentally change how law enforcement interacts with vulnerable citizens. The terms of the settlement were unprecedented. Beyond the substantial financial compensation, the agreement mandated sweeping reforms. Civilian oversight boards with real power, mandatory disability response training, body camera footage automatically shared with civilian review panels, and most significantly, the elimination of qualified immunity for cases involving vulnerable citizens. But this was never about money. Margaret spoke up, her voice stronger now, though still bearing the marks of her stroke. This was about making sure no one else has to live through what I did. The victory extended far beyond Millbrook. State legislators across the country began adopting what became known as Margaret's Protocols, comprehensive guidelines for police interactions with disabled and elderly citizens. The medical alert bracelet that officers had ignored that fateful day became a national symbol for police reform. Inside the rebuilt police department, changes were already visible. The new chief, Jessica Rodriguez, promoted from within the ranks of officers who had spoken out against the abuse, had implemented mandatory partnership with disability advocates. Every officer now trained alongside people with various disabilities, learning to recognize and respond appropriately to different conditions. Mrs. Chen didn't just change our policies, Rodriguez explained during a training session. She changed our perspective. We're here to protect everyone, especially those who need our protection most. The Margaret Chen Foundation, established with part of the settlement money, began its work providing legal assistance to vulnerable citizens facing police misconduct. Its first case resulted in reforms in a neighboring department, creating a domino effect of accountability. Your mother's case created a blueprint, Catherine Rodriguez told James as they reviewed applications from lawyers wanting to join the foundation. Now, when we see these incidents, we have a roadmap for justice. Officer Torres, who had risked his career to expose the truth, became the department's first disability liaison officer. His unit worked directly with the community, building bridges that had been burned by years of misconduct. I carry Mrs. Chen's story with me every day, he said during a community outreach meeting. It reminds us that our badge is a symbol of protection, not power. Margaret's garden, once the scene of violence, bloomed again with renewed purpose. She started a community program teaching gardening to children, including Tomby Patterson, whose TikTok video had helped expose the truth. The garden became a healing space where police officers in training would come to learn about the community they served. Every flower has its own needs, Margaret explained to a group of police cadets visiting her garden. Just like every person you meet on duty, the secret is taking time to understand those needs. The old guard of the department had been completely dismantled. Reynolds and Barnes faced federal charges, along with Captain Drake and others involved in the cover-up. But more importantly, their removal made way for a new generation of officers committed to genuine community protection. 1 year after the incident, Margaret stood, assisted by her son, at the dedication of the new Police Training Center for Community Engagement. The building's entrance featured a wall-length photograph of her garden, with the words, "Protect and Serve All" prominently displayed. My mother once told me that sometimes it takes darkness to show us where the light needs to shine, James said during the dedication ceremony. This center will be that light, training officers to see the humanity in every person they serve. The impact rippled beyond law enforcement. Hospitals began incorporating police interaction training into their patient care protocols. Schools added modules about disability rights and police accountability. Margaret's story became part of the curriculum in police academies nationwide. In her garden, on quiet evenings, Margaret often reflected on the change that had grown from her pain. Young officers would stop by to share updates about reforms they were implementing, or to seek her advice about community relations. Her wheelchair now bore a custom plate reading "Changemaker," a gift from the new recruits. "We did it, Mom," James said one evening, watching the sunset paint her orchids in gentle colors. "We really did it." Margaret smiled, touching the medical alert bracelet that now symbolized not vulnerability, but empowerment. "No, son," she replied, looking at the transformed community around her. "We're just beginning. Every garden needs constant tending, and so does justice." As night fell over Millbrook, the police department's new shift began their patrol, each officer wearing a small orchid pin, a reminder of the woman who had taught them that true strength lies not in power, but in protection, not in force, but in understanding.